grab a seat. Well, good evening. Welcome to the Baker Institute. We're very pleased to have you here with us this evening. I think we have a very interesting program tonight. Some of you perhaps were here in September when John Logsdon presented John F. Kennedy and the Race to the Moon, which was a definitive account of the President's decision to send Americans to the moon. And this evening we have, I think, an equally informative and interesting program. Mark Albrecht is going to be talking to you about his book, Falling Back to Earth, which is really an account of the domestic and international politics that affected the space program with the end of the Cold War in the 1989 to 1992 period, and probably have had a lasting effect carrying on to the program today. Mark served as Executive Secretary of the National Space Council from 1989 to 1992, and I had the good fortune of working for him there as the Director of Civil Space. He was an excellent individual to work for, and they were certainly interesting and challenging times, and I look back on that with fond memories of our times together and our experiences. He's a graduate of UCLA and got his PhD from the Rand Institute, and worked as one of the legislative assistants to Senator Pete Wilson for National Security Affairs before he came into the Space Council. Since that time, he has served as an executive vice president with Science Applications International Corporation, and more recently with International Launch Services, which is a joint venture of Lockheed Martin and Kunischev in Russia that provided launch services from Baikonur for payloads. He's had a very interesting career since he left the Space Council, and certainly he had a very interesting time while he was there. So let me turn it over to Mark.
Well, thank you, George. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here, and I'm happy and delighted to be able to tell you a little bit about the book I wrote called Falling Back to Earth. First, it's great to be in Houston and the Baker Institute and Rice University, all of which play central roles in America's space program, and that's really what we're here to talk about. I can't say enough about my good friend George Abbey. I learned more from George Abbey than just about anybody in the space program, and I think I'm not unique in that. I think a lot of people, and some we know very well, learned almost everything they know about the space program from George. It's a real pleasure and honor to have worked with him and to be introduced by him tonight. I also want to personally acknowledge the founder of the Institute, Secretary James Baker, whose patriotism and dedication and strong devotion to a free America have been an inspiration for all those who had the honor and pleasure of serving with him in government. George and I were there when he was Secretary of State, just a remarkable figure and a great individual. And now many of the students here who benefit from his generosity of time and resources that are here to think about our future. So Secretary Baker just stands out as a great American, and this is in a wonderful institute and a phenomenal setting for this kind of work. And as George said, he crafted the idea of having this lecture series with a couple of books. My friend, good friend, our friend John Logsdon wrote the wonderful book, John F. Kennedy and the Race to the Moon, which in some sense is the beginning. And this book that I wrote is a 20-year down the road view of where the space program was, and we will talk a little bit about that. John certainly pointed out that the Cold War was the animating feature in the U.S. space program. He well documents and tells a compelling story about how President Kennedy came to the decision that, in fact, this was a challenge that was a great stretch for America. It's something that we could do, and it's something that we could prove to the world under the greatest challenge we had, both economically, technologically, militarily, in the latter half of the 20th century. So John was here, and he talked a little bit about his book, which I guess you could call as a beginning, And rather than saying that this book is about the end, I choose to use Churchill's quote, which says, this is not the end, it's not even the beginning of the end, but perhaps it's the end of the beginning. And I think that's a pretty apt sense of what my book is about and what I have to say in it. Let me start by kind of setting the stage and the motivation for the book, and then we'll talk a little bit about what's inside. And a lot of this is kind of rough stuff, and I'm not thrilled with the results and the conclusions that I've drawn, but it's done in a spirit of admiration and a spirit of hope and a spirit of dedication to the American space program. But the fact of the matter is, and we might as well get it out on the table and all of you know, that today the U.S. civil space program is broken. And our national security space program is not far behind. We have no American access for humans to space for the first time in 40 years. It's remarkable. We have no long-term mission or goal for human spaceflight. We have a space station that took over 20 years to build, cost $100 billion, and is so limited that it's deemed of only marginal utility for science by the National Academy of Science. We have a follow-on to the remarkable Hubble Space Telescope. Randy was the program manager designed to fix the Hubble Space Telescope, called the Webb Space Telescope. It was originally planned in 1996 as a $500 million 5-year discovery program. In 2002, it was changed from the Next Generation Space Telescope and became the James Webb Space Telescope. And at that time, in 2002, it was going to be a $5 billion program, and it was going to launch in 2013. Today, the Webb telescope is now approaching $9 billion in cost and won't launch until 2018, if then, and if $9 billion holds. And both cost and schedule are mounting with no bound in sight. Now President Obama tells us that even though we don't have an exploration goal, and even though we don't have an exploration program to pursue, we need a new large launch vehicle to get us there. And I know it's controversial, but this program is already stalemated, proceeding on a big dumb booster is what we always called it. And it's a space equivalent of a bridge to nowhere. It wasn't selected by a competitive process. It wasn't focused on developing new technologies. It was designed and essentially forced on NASA by members of Congress and their staffs that kludged together pieces from the aging shuttle infrastructure. And without a compelling mission rationale, and this is the important part, that would provide a sustaining sense of urgency for this program, in all likelihood it'll be another contested, overrun, late, and ultimately canceled program. Over the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to spend 95% of what we would have spent on shuttle infrastructure. And we won't have any shuttle flights. And the first flight of this new heavy lifter won't be until 2017, and it won't be capable of flying astronauts until 2021. That's if it stays on cost, on schedule, as it does today. It's simply too expensive, it's too slow, and it's too old. But it's what the Congress is insisting that we build. With the solid rockets of the shuttle, the main engines of the shuttle, the external tanks of the shuttle, assembled and prepared in shuttle facilities at the Cape, and launched from the shuttle launch pad, all to carry a new capsule that has been called Apollo on steroids. It doesn't sound like the 21st century to me, and it doesn't sound like the American space program. And my guess is NASA won't even have enough budget to do that. Congress is going to cut the NASA budget to meet already agreed upon aggressive deficit reduction plans. We have a static NASA infrastructure that costs $7 billion a year, with about 20,000 employees at headquarters and 10 field centers that are highly redundant, unfocused, parochial, and fiercely independent. Decision-making at NASA has become extraordinarily decentralized. Field centers and mission directorates operate more as a council of peers than centers of excellence and custodians of mission specialties. And not surprising, lowest common denominator thinking and action dominate. Simply put, NASA's overall budget is almost $19 billion a year. We're spending more and more and getting less and less. And as I said before, the National Security Space Program is not far behind. The same thing is happening at the Defense Department. Just last week, Boeing Executive Vice President Jim Albaugh said, for the first time in 100 years, we being Boeing, do not have a design team working on a new manned airplane. Should we fail to reverse this trend, Jim said, within 10 years we could lose the capacity to do so for a generation. We used to be a net exporter of technology. Now we are a net importer. So does it matter? I think yes, absolutely it matters, because while our space program burns, the United States is losing its technology edge. It's losing its engine of innovation. We're losing an aerospace industry that we invented. Billions of dollars are being spent on what amount to jobs programs, devoid of any central purpose or urgency. Peter Thiel, who's an internet entrepreneur, co-founder of PayPal, and an angel investor to projects like Twitter, recently said, although the last 40 years have brought advancements in computers and the web, I am nostalgic for the 1960s, when people were still dreaming of putting a man on the moon. This decade and the 20 years that preceded it was the golden era for technology. He said innovation slowed down dramatically in the 1960s. Today, Mr. Thiel said, we are not focused enough on getting back to a culture of innovation. People are just trying to figure out ways to coast. He concludes by asking a chilling question. Is Facebook really worth $7 billion? Is this what America will contribute to innovation in the 21st century? And incredibly, even yesterday, President Obama in San Francisco said, we have lost, this is yesterday, President Obama in San Francisco said this, we have lost our ambition, our imagination, our willingness to do things like build the Golden Gate Bridge. Pretty incredible. So, the book. How did this happen? Wasn't anybody paying attention? Did anybody try and stop this? What can we do now? This is really what was this inspiration for me to write this book, because I think Americans deserve to know how we got to where we are and whether people tried to do something to end up in a different square in 2011 than the one we're on today. So this is the animating force behind the book. And it's the story of how the administration of President George H.W. Bush, President 41st, attempted to turn the tide of Cold War retrenchment from sweeping aside the incredible technological, economic, and innovative surge by America in the latter half of the 20th century, and how and why it failed to halt the decline in the fortunes of its centerpiece, America's space program. So let me take you back. It's a long way, I can see from some of these faces, way back to the dark ages of 1988. It seemed just like yesterday, some of us. In the summer of 1988, then Vice President George H.W. Bush and Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis were vying for the presidency after 2 terms of Ronald Reagan. And congressional authorizers, the committees that authorize, were really troubled about the state of America's space program. They were concerned about the bloated and unmanageable Space Station Freedom. Some of you probably don't even know what Space Station Freedom was, but there's enough scar tissue in the first 2 or 3 rows here. We remember very well what Space Station Freedom was. Congress was concerned about it. They were concerned about the problems with the space shuttle. After all, 1988 was only 2 years after the Challenger accident. The expensive and frantic ramp-up of converted ICBMs for the Defense Department who needed launches, who were completely converted to putting all, there was a period of time when America was going to put all of its payloads, defense, civil, commercial, on the space shuttle. It was going to fly 20, 25 times a year. And after the Challenger accident, there was a mad scramble in the Defense Department to recover and get payloads, national security payloads, into space. And they had to go back to ICBMs that had been slowly evolved and converted into space launch vehicles, and they were buying them at a rapid rate and spending lots of money on them. And the Congress was concerned. So in the 1989 NASA authorization bill, they authorized the new administration, at this point they didn't know whether it was going to be the Dukakis or the Bush administration, to recreate something called a National Space Council, originally conceived in the Kennedy administration. John probably talked about it a little bit in his book. And the purpose was to bring coherence, continuity, and efficiency to the national space enterprise. It was a little noticed because we're in the middle of a presidential campaign. Later, newly elected President George H.W. Bush agreed and by executive order established a National Space Council, and in March of 1989, I was named to be Executive Secretary of the National Space Council. So this book is really a personal accounting of the events and people who sought a new direction and a new beginning, if you will, of the space program for the 21st century. In 1988, NASA was in turmoil. The shuttle had just returned to flight, September '88, after a 2-year stand down after the Challenger accident. The space station, which was originally briefed to President Reagan as a $3 billion 8-year project, had already grown to $30 billion in estimated cost, in growing complexity, and it was almost a decade off. In 1990, mysterious hydrogen leaks were delaying flight after flight of the space shuttle. It would be delayed for 3 months, 4 months, 6 months. The Hubble Space Telescope, an enormous achievement, was launched, and within 72 hours was declared a failure because there were faulty fabrication in the main telescope mirror. NASA was being called the gang that couldn't shoot straight. And in fact, NASA was in disarray. It's hard to remember. A lot of these are painful memories. But in 1989, the Wall Street Journal had a front page article about a Senate subcommittee appropriations clerk named Dick Mallow. And the title of the article on the front page of the Wall Street Journal was King Mallow. And the thrust of the article was that this clerk of a subcommittee of the House Appropriations Committee was running NASA. Front page, Wall Street Journal, 1989. But that's not all. The Soviet Union was in the process of complete collapse. In 1988, we didn't know it, but they were. In 1988, General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev had introduced perestroika to the Soviet bloc of the nations of Eastern Europe. He was challenging the West to radically reduce the number of forces in Western Europe. As a matter of fact, in Secretary Baker's book and in President George H.W. Bush book with Brent Scowcroft, they recount the fact that they felt that Gorbachev was being incredibly shrewd, that he was in fact daring the United States to withdraw forces from NATO because he claimed he would do it from Warsaw Pact. We saw this as a very shrewd strategic move when in reality it was the first overt sign of collapse of the Soviet Empire. What we didn't know at the time was that the Soviet Union was already corroding from within, and its once vaunted military space program was unraveling. We learned that, at the time, by Soviet scientists that were coming over and telling this, but also as part of the book, I described the period of time, as George said, when I was working on a partnership with colleagues at Khernichev Space and Research Center in Moscow, who had built the ICBMs and many of the space weapons that the Russians were doing in the Cold War. And they told us at the time that they were unraveling, that they had very few resources in their space program during this period of time. Its leadership was caught up, it being the Russian space program, was caught up in vicious infighting, and independently were scrambling for a post-Cold War role with America. We just didn't know. But that's not all. Despite the unforeseen and imminent victory of the Cold War, large federal deficits and a looming economic recession in the United States created a push for what was called a peace dividend for reduced defense spending at home. When the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, the calls for draconian defense cuts were overwhelming. Reductions in the order of 30% were a reality. These would be the largest defense cuts since the end of the Vietnam War. Our defense industrial base was in free fall as the Cold War loomed. We were facing an unknown crises in the engine room of America's incredible innovation machine. And all of this was just starting to come to focus as the world was preparing for complete transformation. So this book is about, it's a first-hand account. It's written in a very personal fashion. It's not an academic piece. It's not citing a lot of articles, etc. It's what actually happened, the real events, the real characters and the real actors, what we tried to do at that period of time. And it shows the action plan that we had. We wanted to deal with the fact that NASA lacked focus and theme. It was spending money on programs that were not performing. They were not coordinated. They were not working together. The Defense Department and the Energy Department had enormous industrial capabilities with the national labs and, of course, the great defense industrial base that were looking at 30–40% reductions in their staff. We were trying to forge, President Bush in particular, was trying to forge a vision for what America's role in the world would be after a Cold War. And we crafted a plan. The President, of course, led all those efforts to craft a plan that would allow us to address all of those things simultaneously. And if I can figure out how to do this, and I'll try that. Oh, try that. Oh, whoop. Then I'll get this. Then on July 20th, 1989, the 20th anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing, the United States was committed by President Bush on that day at the National Air and Space Museum. George and I were there. And he said, in 1961, it took a crisis, the space race, to speed things up. Today, we don't have a crisis, we have an opportunity. And to seize this opportunity, I'm not proposing a 10-year plan like Apollo. I'm proposing a long-range, continuing commitment. First, for the coming decade, for the 1990s, space station freedom, our critical next step in all of our space endeavors. And the next, for the new century, back to the moon, back to the future, and this time, back to stay. And then a journey into tomorrow, a journey to another planet, a manned mission to Mars. He went on to say, the space station is the first and necessary step for a sustained manned exploration, one that we're pleased had been endorsed by Senator Glenn and Neil Armstrong, and so many of the veteran astronauts we honor here today. But it's only a first step. And today I'm asking my right-hand man, our able Vice President, Dan Quayle, to lead the National Space Council in determining specifically what is needed for the next round of exploration. The necessary money, manpower, and materials, the feasibility of international cooperation, and to develop realistic timetables, milestones along the way. The Space Council will report back to me as soon as possible with concrete recommendations to chart a new and continuing course to the moon and Mars and beyond. July 20th, 1989. But unlike Apollo, this was not going to be a crash program, as the President said. It would take decades. And rather than have technologies and new technologies be a spin-off of a race to the moon, in fact, new inventions and new technologies would not be a byproduct, but would rather be an objective unto itself. We would go look for new technologies. We would try to stretch the envelope in terms of the technologies. We would look to find ways to do things faster and cheaper, and we believed that by doing them faster and cheaper, they would actually be better. We would reinvent the way we were doing space along the way. And as a new national goal, the Space Exploration Initiative would be led by NASA, but we expected the entire federal enterprise to be involved. DoD, DARPA, the National Reconnaissance Office, and the Department of Energy. And this time, our exploration would not be a competition with international rivals, the Soviet Union, but in cooperation with all the efforts of all the space nations of the world, and in particular, the Soviet Union, now Russia. So that's the story. That's what President Bush said. He was only 6 months into his administration. A lot of hard work by a lot of people to understand where we were. And it is just a remarkable testimony to the leadership and vision of President Bush and Vice President Quayle and Secretary Baker to have taken such an enormous step in such a short period of time. But you have to appreciate the situation in 1989. We were facing, on one end, the greatest victory since World War II, the end of World War II, and on the other, a precipice that was going to threaten the technological and economic development and great success we had experienced in the latter half of the 20th century. So we offered this plan and this program, and I will be honest, we were naive. I'll be the first to admit it. We believed that offering a floundering agency, NASA, a lifeline of support and a vision and resources. President Bush in 1989 asked for a 24% increase in NASA spending in 1990, with 12% annual increases for the 5 years following. This in the midst of a deficit crisis and an economic recession that is parallel to what we're experiencing today, not nearly as severe. But he was offering a 24% increase, demanding a 24% increase in NASA resources. And we were wrong. We thought we would be met with an enthusiastic response and aggressive action to bring the space station, the space shuttle, all the existing pieces of the space program into conformity of meeting this new goal, aggressively looking for new technologies. And we did not get that response. We thought if we changed leadership and replaced the unwilling with the willing, we could turn the ship and right the course. But we were wrong. As I say, we were famously said by the salty sea captain in Jaws, at some point we looked at each other and said, it looks like we're going to need a bigger boat. It was a remarkable period of time and remarkable response. So this book, Falling Back to Earth, is really a cautionary tale of how a federal agency with a large contractor base, significant constituent services mentality, in the absence of strong and persistent leadership, can drift from a primary instrument of national will, a center of excellence aimed at innovation and daring, into a risk-averse feudal empire completely resistant to executive direction. And by the way, the Russians fared no better. The third part of the book, which we'll talk about in a second, is about my relationship with the Russians, both in the White House and then later when I was working with them as partners. And they fared no better. They were strapped for cash and forced to harvest their space technology immediately upon the collapse of the Soviet Union. Investment in new capabilities was completely shut down. The United States essentially bankrolled the Russian space program from 1990 until 2005. And Randy Brinkley knows that. Between our business and the space station business, which George and Dan Goldman kind of resurrected the space station program, the reality, the untold story, part of that is told in this book, is that the United States basically funded the Russian space program from 1990 till 2005 in order to salvage the shuttle, the space station program, and to ensure that Russian rocket technicians did not sell their wares and expertise to emerging nations. And there were many emerging nations, names of which you're very familiar with, who eagerly were seeking Russian technical support for developing intercontinental ballistic missiles on their own. These countries were hell-bent on acquisition of nuclear weapons and ballistic missile technologies. Russian scientists and engineers had that capability, and in this period of time, they were literally starving. The book itself is divided into three parts: 1989 to 1992, with the new Bush administration and the plans that we talked about to revitalize, restructure, and refocus the civil space program in a post-Cold War world, and our plans to engage the space enterprise of the former Soviet Union in a joint mission to Mars. We actually laid out our vision and our plan that we would go, in fact, back to the moon and onto Mars together. And the role of industrial cooperation in space played redirecting the global space cooperation and recollection of Soviet space scientists about the end of the war. So, the second part of the book takes place in 2001 in the new Russia, and the role that industrial cooperation in space played in redirecting the global space cooperation, and and the end of the Cold War from their perspective. So a lot of the second part of the book talks about what the Russians told us later about what was happening during this period of time from their perspective. And finally, the third part of the book is about my assessment of what needs to be done to rescue America's space program and to return us to an era of innovation, exploration, and unbounded technology development. So let me say a few words about that. In my view, NASA needs to be raised, and I mean that in both senses of the words. The performance of the organization needs to be elevated, and much of the institution needs to be flattened. Centers simply need to be closed. The mission of NASA needs to be clarified, focused, and significantly reduced. The redundancy and duplication of non-core activities simply have to stop. And these are, when you go through the list of things that are non-core activities that NASA does, I'm not saying these are not things the government ought to be doing. I'm not saying that these are not valuable things. I'm saying they're not things NASA should be doing. NASA managers must be allowed to manage and to get the culture of strong management and leadership back to the agency, which means firing people based on performance, not tenure. I know it's a bit of a pipe dream in the civil service, but I think with a strong vision and strong leadership, we can return to some of that. Congress needs to back off the micromanagement and pork barrel spending of NASA. NASA's budget just gets carved up and gone to various districts. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. Nobody's doing anything wrong. They're doing what comes naturally. This is what happens in the absence of clear leadership and a clear direction. NASA needs to rebreed an innovative, aggressive, goal-oriented spirit. It needs to be more Bell Labs and less the government university. During Apollo, the engineers, George knew, setting on the consoles of mission control where the average age is in their late 20s and 30s. July, when the last space shuttle flew, the average age of the engineers on the consoles of mission control were in their 40s and 50s. Many of them were the same men and women. We've become all flour and no yeast. Young engineers should come to NASA because it's the most innovative and exciting place to work. And they should leave to start or join space enterprises that'll build the future. Can it be done? Of course it can be done. Americans can do anything they put their minds to. And as the election of 2012 comes closer, I'll tell you, for my part, I'm going to be looking less of who offers to spend the most on space and which candidates promise more about the leadership and management of NASA, who know how to lead the agency, harness the bureaucracy, and hire people just like themselves to administer programs that make the cut at the new NASA. So that, in short, is what the book's about. As I said, it's written firsthand. Many of the people here are in it, and hopefully you'll like it. I'm really trying to put this from the perspective of an ordinary American who'd say, well, what would it be like if I was there? What did I see? What did I hear? What were people saying? What were we thinking? What was the motivation? I spent a lot of time talking about what it's like. George and I worked together in the White House. It's a pretty exciting experience. And it's something that, without detouring and becoming a travelogue, I try to explain it to people, what it's like to work in the White House, what your experience is day to day. Some of the characters you've known in history, of course, Secretary Baker, et cetera, what they're like as people when you're dealing with them, what was on their minds, what they were trying to do, what the perceptions were. So it's a book that I hope you enjoy. It's intended to be a bit of a wake-up call, to explain where we are today, how we got there, what we tried to do to make the 2011 that we experience today different than where we are today. And with that, George, I'd be happy to take any questions. And thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Well, I think after that discussion, we would probably get a few questions. So, anyone in the audience? Yes.
Dr. Albrecht, I came to America in 1960, and I didn't speak English that I do now, but I do remember one thing. When Soviets exploded 50 megaton nuclear device, we in America were scared because they had 50 megaton bombs and we did not. Our megatonnage was of order of 5 megatons. And this is the era that these young guys here are blessed. They never heard this, that maybe it's better to be red than dead. You remember that? Maybe you remember that.
Very well.
And next thing I knew, a few years later, Americans are landing on the moon. And I'm thinking, how much was that in response to a serious threat? We didn't know we were dealing with a paper tiger that ultimately was going to, collapse. We thought it was a real threat to us Americans. And my question to you is, in absence of a real threat like this, what is going to wake us up and propel us into something like that we can do things like we did in 60s?
Well, it's the question many of us have struggled with for 20 years. There is no silver bullet, Bo. It's an expression of the collective will. I mean, the question is, what's motivating the Chinese? What's motivating the Indians? They don't see any great threat. It's because they're a country or nation in ascendancy. They feel the bumptious pride of exploration. They're willing to spend the money and take the risk. They don't say, well, we could be spending the money on this or that. But there's no imminent threat that the Chinese are facing. So it's a matter of I'm not disputing your point. In fact, John's book is a wonderful explanation of just how panicked we were, and the unanimity. He had no problem getting the Hill to support him. They were clamoring on, we've got to do something. So yes, a threat and a scare is plenty motivation, obviously. But there's plenty of other examples of where countries have spent a lot of money on exploration, and they do it out of an expectation that their nation is going to derive great unknown benefits from the exploration. And I would just offer the Chinese and Indians today as examples of people that are hell-bent on getting to the moon and beyond, and they're willing to take the risk and pay the price to do so, and they're not under any particular threat. They're doing it because their country is a country that they want to make a statement to the world is prepared for global leadership and an expectation of excellence and a demonstration of their technology prowess. So I don't. We've all looked for the answer. The one answer I gave back in the day when we finally exhausted it was, if there was a threat of an asteroid coming to Earth that was going to destroy the Earth in 15 years, and it was pretty certain that it was going to happen, my sense is everybody would get working on stuff right away. Again, scare, threat.
So what do you believe will actually wake up the American people and the politicians? Do we have to wait for the Chinese to weaponize the moon?
Well, I tell you, that is the ultimate fear, that your generation wakes up one morning to find that Chinese tackonauts have landed on the moon, and the world responds with just the same thrill, excitement, and transfixing as it did in the late 60s when America did. And your generation, the kids at Rice University, young men and women, I should say, gee, I didn't know we did that. We did that? And a lot of us guys who have sort of consoled ourselves for the last 10 years with, well, we've been there, we've done that. Not millions and millions of young Americans who say, that's like back in the dark ages. So hopefully it's not that kind of wake-up call. Hopefully something like the current economic straits of the United States, where we begin to do an inventory to say, how did we get here economically? How did we go from the country you grew up in to where we find ourselves today with data after data after data that are showing us second or third or fifth or 10th? And they start saying, we start saying, that isn't us and that's not going to satisfy us. Where did we go wrong? How do we get back on track? And I believe that one of the things that we'll discover is that our space program was critical in making us who we were in the latter part of the 20th century. And we say, let's go back and try to fix that, because it'll get us out of the ditch again. Don't know, but great question.
Thank you.
Yes.
About 3 or 4 weeks ago, a committee or group of 14 nations, space agencies across the world calling themselves the International Global Exploration Group, published a global exploration roadmap. So my question is two-part. What are your thoughts on global exploration roadmap that eventually may lead human beings to Mars? And then the second part of the question is what you envision in your perspective should NASA's role be in that global quest for exploration to Mars?
I'm not familiar with the plan, so I can't comment on the idea that future exploration would be a collaborative international experience rather than a solitary national experience. I think the jury is in on that. I think that's the way we're going to have to go in the future. The United States is going to have to learn how to lead without being necessarily always in the lead. Part of the experience, there are people at NASA today who have had experience on the space station. I mean, let's face it, the brutal fact is the United States space station wouldn't exist without the Russians. The first element of the space station was a Russian element, launched on a Russian launch vehicle. There are a lot of people who have learned how to collaborate without a fear of loss of identity by not being the predominant leader. On the other hand, somebody's got to be in charge. You cannot have a project of that kind of scope that does not have leadership that is not just in name only, but in fact has the authority to make hard decisions, because you will be making them all the time. So nobody's yet figured out the right combination. The fact that it will be international, that it's stupid not to use the resources from the centers of excellence around the world and various things. The United States already learned that in rocket propulsion. The fact of the matter is the Russians make wonderful engines, and we're silly not to use them because they're very, very good, they're very reliable, they have a lot of performance in ways that we haven't been able to duplicate. So we're getting over that part of it. I think it needs to be international, but somehow you have to construct it in a way that there is a clear and empowered leadership. That part is always the trickiest part, and again, it's going to take people who decide that's what we're going to do and empower people to make those hard decisions, and then stand behind them when they make the hard decisions.
Yes.
You mentioned that one of the ways to fix the current problem that our space program is in is to get Congress to stop micromanaging what goes on in NASA. What are some ways do you think that could happen to get Congress to actually stop doing that?
Well, fortunately or unfortunately, I spent 6 years working there, so I have a pretty good feel for how the place works. And you know what? These are tough men and women who work in Congress, and they're out to do the best by their constituents. But they also are great patriots. And it's always in the absence of leadership where you find this sort of looking at pure constituent services. And if one member's doing it, then another member says, well, he just carved out this bit for his I'm going to carve it out for mine. I believe, and knowing the men and women there, that if you have leadership in the civil space program that sits down with them and says, we're actually trying to do something here. This is the plan, this is the program, it's aggressive. We need all the resources focused on. This is the role that your area plays in this. And it's a role that it plays because it's the best and it's necessary that it be done with that group at that place. And I'm asking you not to erode and undermine this program by trying to force feed more activities into your area simply to create a few more jobs. It sounds a little Pollyannish and naive, but it's part of a general sense of leadership, of respect, where people know where you're going and why you're going and how you're going there, and you have clear communication with them. I know that can be effective with members of Congress that will do things that will not just greedily attack their constituency. They will participate in something larger, but they're not going to do it in and of themselves.
Yes.
What's your view of commercial crew? Do you feel it will advance the nation's mission in terms of space exploration, or no?
Well, you know, this is a tough question. It's always difficult to know when you're ready to commercialize really challenging technical activities. And many of us in this room have been involved in the space program for 30 or 40 years. And there is a little bit of the way we do it is the way we do it. And we've met with enormous success over time. And so when people start trying to deviate or start deviating from what we considered the school book solution to quality and mission assurance, et cetera, we tend to be very skeptical and we tend to be a little dismissive. But in element after element, the government has been able to hand off to private industry technology innovations, and they've taken it to a whole new level. The question is not whether that's going to happen, but when's the right time. And it's very difficult when you're in the middle of it to know whether you're on the front end or the back end of that decision. Clearly, commercialized space activities are beginning to come into their own. They've been given responsibility, and I think the administration deserves some credit, this administration, of saying we're going to take the space station and we're going to commercialize it. We're going to try to offload from government activities to commercial activities, the purpose of which is to offload the resources and the focus so that we can be doing other more cutting-edge things. Whether we'll make it, it's going to be difficult. It's going to be a huge challenge, and there's going to be lots of ups and downs. I'll give you one example. I talked to Richard Branson a while back about his galactic, Virgin Galactic. That's going to take people up and down on Burt Rutan's, what's it called, Blue something or other. Pardon me, spaceship. You guys probably know more than me. You're more up on it. So I said, you know, you're going to kill people. Are you ready? Because it's not going to be pretty. When on the front of Time magazine, they're going to have you and your picture and the grieving families. And he said to me, he smiled, typical Richard Branson smile, and said, do you know how many people a year die on Mount Everest?
I said, no, I don't know.
He said 4 every year, year in, year out. All very rich, all taking a ridiculously risky attempt to climb Mount Everest, all of whom die in the effort, and nobody writes about it, and nobody cares about it, and nobody sues people about it. They sign all the releases. So he said, I understand that when it comes to this activity, it's going to be a little different. But the world can tolerate the kind of risk and accidents that will occur. That's an important part of whether or not you can make this transition, because it is risky and it is dangerous and people will die. But the question is, can we do it with commercial crew? The answer is eventually yes. Is it now? I'm just not far enough into it to know exactly what all the difficulties are in making it come to be, but we're close. Are we 5 years ahead of the curve? Or are we 10 years ahead of the curve? Or are we right where we need to be on the curve? It's just too impossible to judge at this point. That's always going to be true when you make this transition.
You showed the picture of President Bush and the announcement and the formation of the National Space Council, and started out very hopeful. So then you said, well, it wasn't received as we thought it would be. Do you mean by Congress or the American public, or where did the hopeful leadership from that National Space Council fall off the rails?
Well, it's a little bit of all of the above. As I said, we were surprised at the response of NASA as an institution. We thought that NASA, we were naive. We thought that NASA would embrace this and say, thank God, we've been waiting for this. Finally, we have some, a direction, and we've got all these pieces that have interesting pieces, but we can go back and we can change them and focus on how they fit into this larger vision. They did not respond that way. They responded that this is the program of record, and if you want to add more on top to the program of record, we're for it. But if you want to change the program of record, we're not for it. Not only are we not for it, we're willing to take steps to undermine it. I mean, shocking. You'll see some of the, well, you won't be that shocked, but some of the things in here are pretty shocking, of where not only did the agency not bend every effort to implement the program, they actually went around and tried to undermine it. We, at the time, had a Congress, as I said, in 1989, the Wall Street Journal was reporting that a subcommittee of an appropriations committee was running the program. Well, he didn't think this was such a good idea. And so he had all the power. And so, you know, there was just a lot of struggle. We had the contractor community that had contracts for the existing program. Their customer was kind of dragging their feet on it, so they kind of dragged their feet on it. It's a tale of that. And we're making a lot of progress towards the end, and then Desert Storm came along. Iraq invaded Kuwait. And within 6 months, the United States had the largest combined force war since World War II. 500,000 people were in theater, Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. And the defense industrial base that was interested in trying to get onto this new direction was saying, we're back. So it's a complicated story, and that, in fact, is a story. It's important to see and read.
Can you point to another government agency that maybe has transitioned to 2011 in a more productive way, that has kind of been authorized by government and not been worried about where the district and funding goes, that has had a workforce that has been more Google-like and less, you know, like?
I'm gonna have to think about that. Nothing comes right to mind. It's hard. I mean, it's a central tendency of government. I mean, you know, and those of us who've been in government, it's not evil intent. It's better than Adam Smith's hidden hand. I mean, there's just a tendency to become more bureaucratic and to become slower and to become more consensus building and less directed. But let me think about that. Well, I got one.
Or NIH.
I'll give you one. And again, it had the benefit of being like NASA, the Strategic Defense Initiative organization back in the late 80s, SDIO. It was nimble, it was quick, it didn't suffer from any great bureaucracy, but again, like NASA in 1958, it was created out of whole cloth, so it didn't have a lot of history, etc. It had a lot of money. It had a problem with high national purpose. You couldn't compromise on it. That's the problem with a lot of the energy things, in my personal opinion, is you can't move the goalpost. You can't go to halfway to the moon and say, well, we did pretty good. We got halfway. Didn't bring anybody back. But I mean, the problem with a lot of this energy research, people say, well, why don't we just spend $1 billion and make becoming energy independent that kind of go to the moon goal? The problem is the price of oil drops by $30 a barrel, which happens all the time, and 90% of the projects you're working on are now just upside down. So SDIO had all of those elements together, and there was a period of time where they were doing things just like the old NASA. As a matter of fact, many of the guys here, I had so many guys from NASA come up to us and say, you know, and there was all kinds of controversy about SDIO. I'm not making it sound like it was absolutely the greatest thing in the world. But a lot of the Apollo era guys from NASA would come up and say, we spent some time with these and we tried to get that kind of cross-pollinization, and said, that's the way it used to be at NASA. They needed things done quickly. They had the authority to do it. It was exciting, it was fun, you couldn't wait to get to work. You were breaking new ground every single day at work. So I would say SDIO was an example of where the government in a short period of time made that kind of stride past 1958. Yes, sir.
It sounds like the root cause here, in your opinion, is the lack of leadership at the top that flows down to inspire leadership at the bottom. One organization that, for all its flaws, that develops leadership would be the DoD. Do you think the answer here might be to put NASA back under the DoD?
Thought about it. Thought about it during a period of time. We thought about taking space transportation out of NASA and say, hey, it's not a core competency. Let's find a place like Defense Department where their space launches are done without the kind of public affairs drama of NASA launches. You know, a lot of people would move over to that activity, but maybe DoD could be a space launch specialty, and NASA could pursue its exploration goals simply taking rides from DoD that had this center of excellence. So we thought about that sort of thing. But you've got your finger right on it. That is the biggest problem, is competent leadership with a vision to execute a plan. And, you know, George would tell me about the early days of NASA, some of the fun, and John Logston's book. I mean, it's fun to read about some of the early NASA leaders who had an enormous capability, insight, were able to motivate people, were tough, had great authority to act in ways that now the civil servant law don't necessarily. But I still believe that if you had strong visionary leadership, competent leadership, that brought people of like mind, men and women who had that kind of experience, that were devoted to make it happen, I think you can turn this vicious cycle back into a virtuous cycle. I'm optimistic that it can happen. Yes, sir.
You had a great expression, Mark, about NASA hopefully being an expression of the collective will of the nation. Given the experiences we went through 20 years ago, everything that's happened since, absent of threat, do you see another path to that expression of collective will? I mean, in all the social media, in Occupy Wall Street, and other things that could be shaped to that?
Of course, it's our great challenge. I'm an optimist. I think that if NASA really got shook up and the media really focused on the fact that it was, you know, we had a BRAC-like experience and 3 or 4 NASA centers were closed and the duplications were taken out and they really were centers of excellence. I mean, something really was happening and people began to pay attention, and there was that kind of visionary leadership that not only just came out of the White House, which, you know, became the white horse that everybody was chasing since John Kennedy. If we could just get the president to say these magic words, everything would be all right. Well, been there, done that, you know. I mean, George was yelling at me one time. I may yell at the Vice President of the United States. No, but that's not enough. You really need to have the leadership inside the agency with a team of people that are devoted to make that happen, and you get the diverts off the side. I think, Mark, that people could get re-excited about NASA, and really exciting things could start happening, and it could capture American imagination, particularly if it's combined with a vision for a new American economy and how we were going to get back to, because the loss is becoming pretty painful to people and pretty painfully obvious. And I think one of the areas of loss is precisely this, is what our civil space program could be doing and was doing.
Yes.
So you mentioned kind of in the media looking at shaking up how NASA can be shook up and kind of getting the public's attention that way. So recently we had an open house at NASA, and every time we do public outreach, they ask for the engineers to go out and talk about their hardware. And a lot of the inputs that I received was I thought NASA was closing. And so if that's the impression that the public is getting, to me that's as shook up as NASA can get. But we're still being welcomed with, oh, it's closing, but you're not knocking down your congressman's door.
Yeah. You know, a dying agency is not very inspirational, but I think one that, you know, America loves a comeback story. And I think if there was a story that reporters reporting that that NASA is coming back, that it's got visionary leadership, that it's going to shake things up, it's going to close things down, it's going to move resources, it knows where it's going, it knows why it's going, and it's got a generation of people, young men and women, that are going to lead it to somewhere. And I don't want to say that I know what the magic somewhere is, although their destinations are pretty obvious, and the resources are there. I think you can get people to be inspired and motivated by the change rather than just experience the slow decline. I don't think that's particularly inspirational.
Yes.
You talked a lot about what you think needs to happen, but I'm curious about what you think actually will happen. What do you see as a greater possibility to grow for NASA's future? A return to the glory days where we're pushing the boundaries of technology and trying to explore into space, or as maybe in a more of an emeritus role where we're living vicariously through China's and India's missions, like you said earlier, where we're providing them with new technology in a supportive role, but not actually launching them ourselves from Florida and things like that? What do you think is more likely?
Well, I don't think there's any question of what's more likely of the two. Well, the question is, are we going to get the collective will to do the one that's better for us as a country? The fact of the matter is, we clearly are in a state right now where people are reassessing where our country is and how we're spending our resources and what we're doing. I think that when that cold, sober assessment is concluded, they're going to find that the space program has added so much to America over its 60 years of existence that it's got to be on the front burner again. But the most likely, no question about it, the most likely is that we keep doing more of what we're doing now, which is, I say, we spend more and more and get less and less. That's the most likely outcome because it's the central tendency. So it's going to take deliberative, hard action to change that.
So do you think it would be not in the interest of the United States to help out the upcoming countries as opposed to doing it or to taking a leading role again? Do you really think it'll be if these countries are pushing the boundaries and we are not, is that necessarily bad for the United States as long as someone is doing it?
Well, see if I can parse that down. I guess my personal opinion is that the human species needs to go. One of the things, my favorite part in my book, my youngest daughter was 9 years old, and we had a party at our house because we were trying to sell this president's program, and we had all the national space leaders from industry, et cetera. And Carl Sagan, who was a good friend, a great guy, was sitting on a couch talking to my youngest daughter, and I asked her afterwards, I said, what were you talking about? She said, I asked him, well, why are you so interested in space? And he said, well, for me, it's really simple. Because there's one question that can only be answered by space exploration. And in my opinion, it is the single most important question of all time, whether it's yes or no. And the question is, are we alone in the universe? Either yes or no, definitively, would be the most important question in all of human existence. And so he said, that's why I'm interested. So I think the answer to your large mega question is yes. I think it is humans' destiny to go because we've got to answer that question one way or another. And we want to answer that question one way or another. And that will be ultimately the animating force for us to do it, whether it's us and the Chinese and us, whatever, it'll happen. I think we know how to do this, and we have the experience to do it, and we have the capability to do it. It's just a question of whether we get the will once again to say, yeah, that's what we're going to do.
Let's take one more question, and then you can talk to Mark outside. Yes.
So the central theme of your talk tonight, and I assume of your book as well, is an erosion of leadership. And my curiosity is your opinions as to what contributed to that erosion of leadership, not just on an individual basis, but also, on a national level, almost an unwillingness to lead through national pride.
That's a very big question, and there are lots of parts to that. Let me just grab one tentacle. It's become very, very difficult to attract the best people to go into government because government work is really, really hard. And the sacrifices you have to make, not just in terms of resources, but the sacrifices of privacy, the sacrifices of your career, the risks in taking on the system, have gotten to the point where a lot of the very best people are not interested in being involved in government work. And that's meant that we've not had the best people to choose from. And that's a shame and great difficulty, and it has limited. So that's just one tentacle of how we got there. Another is that it's going to take a lot of energy, and you'll read that in the book. it takes a lot of focus and energy for the first one to start turning that wheel from a vicious cycle into a virtuous cycle. And the question is, at the top, what administration is going to have so much invested in this particular problem that they're going to dismount and take the time and energy it takes to start creating the top cover to go get the best people, and then back them up when they start pushing against the system that is constantly redirecting towards a central tendency, which is to do things the status quo way. So that's just a lot of time and attention. In fact, what you read in this book is that it's remarkable that President Bush and Vice President Quayle and Secretary Baker and John Sununu and Dick Darman were willing to put their time and policy focus into trying to start turning this in a different direction. So it's a complicated question, but it's going to take a big commitment. I'd just, this is again my personal opinion, but I think the Obama administration, when they came in, were kind of willing to lean into the wind a little bit. They did some things that were not very popular. And in my opinion, about sometime in the middle of last year, they just said, we're done. We're done with this, you know. Don't kill anybody. But please don't come knock on our door anymore for help with this or that or the other thing. I mean, you'll see, and hopefully you get a real appreciation if you read the book, that it requires consistent, strong leadership, and it's a lot because, you know, when you're in the White House, there are a lot of things happening all the time, and to take your time and energy, your precious time and energy, to focus on this problem and not those problems is going to take a lot.
Well, thank you, Mark.
Well, George, thank you. Thank you very much.
And we have a reception right outside here, and I think Mark will not only be glad to sign any of the books that you purchased, but he'll be glad to answer some more questions. So thank you all for coming.